Hey everyone, Bradley Jack Design here with another design breakdown, this time my Coco Gauff graphic from this year's Wimbledon. I'm going to just hop right in and show you what it took to make this design. I'm also going to show you how I clipped this racket out. In the other composition of this, you can see the more behind the racket here. This you can't really tell because of how I have it, but I'm going to show you how I would clip a racket out. So if you want to do it in one of your tennis designs, you can do the same. So let me just go in here and turn off all of the layers. If you click and drag on these eyeballs and drag down or drag up, it'll actually hide or show all layers. Just a fun little fact. So let's actually turn the background on, turn all of this off. Okay, so what this starts off with is this stock image I have of bottom grass. This is actually, you can see clearly, a clay court. And then I have some of the same images that I basically just expanded and made bigger and then put a court on top of it just so it's the court, and basically expanded the sky behind it. I then have a gradient map layer here to turn just this court part green. So I think I pulled some green from the original image that I used for Coco on here, but I wanted to make it a little more green, so I've got a hue and saturation layer here. And if I go to greens, you can see I made a couple edits to it to see how I wanted it to look. I also have in here, I darkened it up a bit and darkened the clouds up just because of some other effects I have going on later on. I wanted to show more detail with the background. So I'm actually going to hop up here, show you what we've got going on. So I've got this photo of Coco here standing. So I've got this photo of Coco standing. I've got a blur on it. I'll explain that in a little bit later. But down back here with the background, I've got her normal shadow footing here set to multiply. And then I've got that with a gradient or a gradient map on top of it just to make it black and white. I also have a blur on this. I don't know why, but I have one. So the shadow is also blurred. Actually, I know why. I'll show that a little bit later. Got this fun little left hidden watermark here with a blur on it. Let me turn that blur off. So I have just Bradley Jack Design over here that I went ahead and blurred just to blur into the background my name. People seemed to get a kick out of that on Twitter, so went ahead and just put my name in there for no reason. So we've got this photo of Coco here. We have this next photo of Coco here that I clipped out. I went ahead and just masked out the bottom portion here. So if I disable this layer mask, you can see it's just this flat image. I went ahead and blended it in. I also have a smart filter on it of a blur gallery. So I have on this a path of her swinging up and to the right, and then I masked all of it except for around her hands and racket and arm. So you can still see her face and her head fine, but the racket and her are blurred. And I did the same thing with Coco, doing a little fist pump here, so it's almost as if she's actually doing a little fist pump. And I just put that compositionally behind this so everything was centered in the middle here. Now these two images look pretty similar, but the photo of Coco standing looks a little different, so I've got a couple edited layers on top of her. So I have a gradient map on here set to luminosity, which you can see just sort of brightens up the whole image of her. And then on top of that, I have a layer titled skin coloring, which is set to color at 50%. And pretty much what I did was I just took a middle of the road darkness eyedropper, probably on her face, like right here, and just painted over where her skin is to see if I can get it to match the other two images. I then threw a color lookup on it just to brighten it up just a little bit as well. It's the 2395 that I use all the time. And that's set to 50%. So that's Coco standing. These are the three main images I used. I'm actually going to attach, if you see below, I'm going to give you these three images, this background image as well, and the net image that I use, so you can try and make this graphic yourself and play around in Photoshop. So next what we have is the rosewater dish. So for the women's trophy, they get this dish. So I found this photo. Let me see if I can Let me disable this layer mask. So I found this photo of Serena Williams, I think, holding this, and I just sort of duplicated it and rotated it, so it's sort of faking that it's actually the disc, and basically her hands are gone. Let me not save that. So I've got that in the background. I wanted it to blend in more though, so I threw a couple color lookups on it. It's actually the same lookup, the 2395. It's just 2 of those just to brighten up the dish. So on top of this, on top of the dish behind Coco with her fist, I have just a couple little lighting things. I have a lens flare. Let me turn all these off somehow if I can click the right thing. There we go. So I have this sort of light bokeh image I use that's set to screen, and then on top of that I have a flare image that brightens it up to make the dish look less apparent. I wanted it to be just sort of faded in the background. And then I have a couple levels layers set to the flare, and then I actually have a gradient map with the same green I used down here on the light to make the light green, so it just gives it a slight green tint to the lighting effect. If we continue on, if we go up here, this looks weird because there's a flare behind her, but it's not in front of her. The lighting seems a little weird, so I went ahead and duplicated that flare and put it on top of her, but I set this to only about 50% because 100% looked a little too much. Then we've got some text. So the text is pretty simple. It's pretty much Lust text, Coco, and then Gauff below with more kerning on it, or tracking. Well, I guess it's kerning. And then I just have this gold texture on top of it. I went ahead and made that into a smart object, and then put a Gaussian blur on it and put it on top of it, so it's sort of glowing just in the middle. And then we come to the net. So this is the thing that gives this the most depth. So what I have here is this net image, and I have it set to a Gaussian blur because it's in the front, so it's blurry. This is the focus, so this is going to be blurred. I have a gradient map on it to take away a lot of the midtones, and then I have a color lookup on it of candlelight just to give it a slight yellow tint, because in the real sun it's not going to look how it is. It's going to look like it's slightly orange. So this net image, so it's sort of an accident of how I got this to work, but I have this net image here. Let me keep going. So this is the original image that I have here. So I went ahead and masked that out, set a gradient map to it of black and white. It's set to screen, so let me set it to normal. Oh, I did some stuff to it. Okay, this makes sense. So I have a gradient map on it. The gradient map is very extreme with the white towards the inside. The net, I have the blending options changed. So what I did was I moved these two here. I moved these over, because basically what's going to happen is, it's not really doing it here. I'll explain this a little bit later. But basically, if I move these all the way down here, you can see anything that's on black or anything that's black is apparent. If you move this over, you can see that black is slowly disappearing. And then if you hold down the Option key, you can drag the right one over and blend it in more. So it's not completely apparent, or that it blends it in more so it doesn't look as dirty. I then actually went in and just masked out all these little inner parts to show the net. And I have this layer in the background of the green. Why, I don't know. It was an accident. I saved it when I was in here, and it looked nice, so with these settings, so I went ahead and kept it the same. So that's how I clipped out the net with a Gaussian blur on it to show some depth. And then I've got a bunch of lighting layers like I usually do. Let me see what we've got in here. Net. So I've got some lens dirt set to screen. I used the green gradient map that I used before on top of that. Same with this image of this sort of flare coming in. I have that colored green just the same. I have this nice rainbow flare here in the front. A little bit of a levels layer to it to get rid of the edges, moving the black over to the right. And then the same gradient map to tint it green. And those are all set to normal. I've got this lighting image I use in pretty much everything, set to screen. Levels layer to get rid of the edges, and then colorizing it using a gradient map from green to dark green to black. Then I have these sort of just these little sparkles that are throughout the image. I have these set with a Gaussian blur to blur it because it looked a little weird normal. Then I went ahead and duplicated that same layer, blew it up like 200%, and then set a deeper Gaussian blur to add a little bit more depth. Then I have a couple color lookups on it. This time I used Candlelight. So if I use that, you can see it gives it a little bit of a warmer hue, and that's set to 25%. And then I've got my Kodak 2395 I use on pretty much everything, set to 100% to glue everything together. And then my watermark here at the bottom. So that's what it took to make this design. I'm going to show you how I would clip a racket now, just real quick. So here's this photo I clipped out of her. Didn't bother clipping out anything with the racket because I was going to do it in the composition itself. So how I would do this is I'm going to duplicate the layer. These are smart objects, by the way, so I'm not being destructive. I'm going to hide this layer, and I'm going to mask this layer, and I'm going to mask out the entire racket part. I'm going to do this just pretty quickly to show you how you guys can do this. That was bad. Blah, blah, blah. Mask, mask, mask. If you want to use the pen tool this time, go ahead, use the pen tool. Probably would be pretty easy to just mask out the circle. The only time I'll tell you to use the pen tool. Just kidding, use it whenever you want. So we've got this racket masked out. I'm going to turn this back layer back on. Basically duplicate the layer. I'm going to invert the mask now on this one. So I've got just the inside and just the outside with her on it. So on the one that's just the inside, which is this top one, you can do two things. There's a couple different ways you can mask a racket. I can just take this layer and set it to screen since it's white on black. Boom, look, it's good. And then maybe I throw a gradient map on top of it that's black and white. Move the black over. Boom, there you go. It's clipped out. Done. Easy peasy. Probably put it behind the original layer. Mask back in some of these areas that are actually supposed to be black. And we're done. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to set this to normal. I'm going to keep the gradient map. Or am I? I'm going to keep the gradient map. And then if you double click on the layer, you can get this blend if, which is what we used before. So you can see if I move this over, it's getting rid of all of that black, which is what we want. We want the white to be showing. Then if we hold down the Option key and move over, we can drag this over however we wish. Now I'm going to play around with a little bit. Like that looks pretty good. So it looks pretty good clipped out. Some of this stuff in the middle here is a little wonky. You can probably go in and duplicate this layer and just paint some of this back in if you wanted. But this will work for me because in the original composition here, it's blurred, so it doesn't really matter. But the reason I would do this, probably over screening it, is because one, her racket is going to have these black marks on it from the logo of the racket. Two, you can save this out as a file and it won't mess anything up with a screened layer. If you set this to screen, it's going to look weird and it's not going to translate well as a smart object. Like I can combine these into a smart object and it doesn't mess up the screen layer. If you were to do it with the screen layer on there, this screened layer would go away. It would just be the regular layer. But this is how I would mask out the racket in there. So you just double click here on the side and it pulls up the layer styles. And you can also right click and then hit blending options. And it'll pull up the same thing. And then you just move this to the right and it gets rid of the black. So that's how I would cut out a racket. It works mainly if you have a background where there's high contrast. So clearly in that image, it's a lot of white on black or white on a dark color. So it made it easy to do. It's going to be trickier if there's a subject behind it or if there's like a crowd behind it or something complicated. But that's how I would cut out a racket. So this is what it took to make my Coco Gauff graphic. Like I said before, I'm going to give you these 5 or 6 photos so you can play around and make a graphic of Coco Gauff, edit the photos however you want, clip them out however you want. But if you guys have any suggestions on design breakdowns you want to see, go ahead and drop a comment below. Other than that, make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks.